Now, many months ago, and I appreciate now we're 7 months in to the murderous onslaught, of course, against Gaza by the Israeli state, backed by US government, the US government, the British government, and other Western governments. I interviewed the brilliant Raz Segal, who is Associate Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And one of the reasons, Raz, it's so important is from the very start, he said we need to listen to what Israeli leaders and officials were saying. And that intent was so rarely, so openly spoken. And that's so important because actually what Israeli leaders and officials said from the start proved the most accurate roadmap to what they actually did. They were not kidding, as it turned out. And yet there was a catastrophic failure, deliberately, I would say, to listen to what Israeli leaders actually said they were going to do. Now, given what's happened with the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, the other what's very important we need to talk about is about the question of impunity. Has impunity for now collapsed? Is that the end of Israeli impunity? There's other things I'm going to talk to you, and Raz is the perfect person to speak to about all of this sort of stuff. So hello, how are you?
Hello, Owen. Thanks for having me again.
It's always an honor to have you. Honestly, so glad we're talking again. So much has happened in the worst possible way, let's be honest, in some ways, but obviously we have moves in terms of accountability. So something good to talk about as well in that sense, if we can describe it in such terms. I just want to talk to you about that point I just made. The reason, obviously there's so many reasons to be angry about everything that's happened, about what I regard as one of the great crimes of our age. The reason I often feel, as somebody who's worked in the mainstream Western media for a very long time, is intent. This question of intent is what you always said from the start, is it's rare that people are so, that a state was so open about what is just open genocidal language and intent. And there were so many statements from the very start about what was planned, which were just, not only was there failure by the Western media to frame their coverage around these statements. So you often basically had this as a war of self-defense with a side debate about is it proportionate or not? We can agree to disagree. That's basically what they did. I'll just give you one example. And I think because this for me just sums it up. So on the 9th of October, the Israeli Army Coordinator of Government Activities in the Territories, that's KOGAT for those who may have heard of it, Major General Ghassan Alian said, Hamas became ISIS and the citizens of Gaza are celebrating instead of being horrified. Human animals are dealt with accordingly. Israel has imposed a total blockade in Gaza, no electricity, no water, no just damage. You wanted hell, you will get hell. Now, the reason I bring that up is that's not subtle. He's not messing around there. He's very clear. He's talking about the civilian population. He's equating them to human animals. That's genocidal. He's making it clear they are collectively guilty and that they will collectively suffer, well, hell is the way he says it, including a total cutting off of the essentials of life, which now form a very important part of the request for an arrest warrant by the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. The reason it's just, I'm just wondering, given you said from the beginning what was going to happen, what do you think in terms of where we're at now? Because I'll ask you about the ICJ and the ICC, but now we have the prospect of accountability. This was quite obvious what was going to happen from the beginning, I would posit. But you were one of the voices making this point, but you got yelled at quite a lot of the time, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea, certainly from my perspective as a scholar of the Jewish world and the Holocaust, but more broadly also, the whole idea of studying genocide and working in Holocaust and genocide studies, and for those working in international law, is not just to study genocide, once it had happened, right? But the idea of genocide prevention, right? And one of the ways, that's why this crime that's considered a crime of crime, quote unquote, right, has this element of intent, so that we have a clear indication, right, that genocide is unfolding or about to unfold, or at the very least that there's grave risk of genocide, right, which activates the convention. And therefore it was very clear, actually, I would argue, as you said, from the very beginning, that we are seeing expressions of, clear genocidal intent, but also action, right, in the sense of the imposition of the total siege that you mentioned, but then also the weaponization of international humanitarian law with the safe areas and the safe routes. That we know today Israel actually bombed Palestinians fleeing on routes that it designated as safe, and it actually used its most destructive 2,000-ton US-made bombs in the south after 13th of October, where it directed Palestinians from the north of Gaza to evacuate. So it basically used international humanitarian law here, these evacuation orders from 13th of October until today, in order to enhance the targeting of Palestinians who are then also fleeing under the conditions of total siege. And we know that this followed a 16-year-old siege on Gaza, so the longest siege in modern history. So in those first few days of the total siege, Palestinians were already very much feeling the impact of the cutting off of clean water, food, fuel, medical supplies. The targeting of hospitals immediately also exacerbated, of course, all of this. So we do have actually, in the language of the convention, the creating of conditions calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group in whole or in part. And this was all clear, within the first week after 7th of October. And then, as you said, Israel proceeded to do what it said it will do, right? And that's why now it's starving millions of Palestinians. There's famine conditions. Of course, Gaza is destroyed. I mean, we also have to remember Israel has killed so far 15,000 Palestinian children, right? That's not an accident, right? And we know actually from past cases that are in front of the ICJ now, actually, the specific targeting of children points to genocidal intent, right? So Israel did what it told us, everyone, that it's going to do. It was very clear in that first week after 7th of October, and unfortunately, it's still very clear. Israel is continuing its genocidal assault now in Rafah. And here we are. Of course, there are many things that have happened in addition. As you said, there's the ICJ and the 3 provisional orders, then the ICC arrest warrants now, and other things that are going on. But we're still in the midst of a genocidal assault on Gaza. 7 months in, it's really horrific that we're all witnessing this, right? A complete and total failure of the international legal system. So we're very much in the moment where it's still incredibly urgent, of course, to stop this genocidal assault.
But before I ask you, just because I want to ask you about impunity, before I do, I mean, the reason I bring this up, it's not like, this isn't about settling scores. It's not like some sort of, private school debating society. This is about accountability, but also learning from what's happened. And I always feared from the start that this attempt to revise history. Oh, well, we didn't know this would all happen. This obviously they went too far. We didn't think this would happen. And what's so striking is the fact that, because you sometimes hear this, there's basically this premature opposition that people got opposed to what before they'd even launched a ground offensive. This keeps coming up at the moment, I know, because the ground offensive didn't, I think it was about 2 weeks in or more. But it was the fact, firstly, obviously, you've got a huge bombing campaign beginning almost immediately, but you also got this rhetoric from the start. And I just say this because I think some of the people who backed it publicly are now trying to backtrack. But I would just say it was quite obvious, wasn't it? They said they were going to have a massive siege, and that's obviously a fundamental part of what the International Criminal Court's chief prosecutors request for arrest warrants is about. That's why I'm saying it. It was obvious if we just listened.
Yeah. There's something to say about this, which is very important, is that, it's related to what you're asking. People, have asked, why do we actually see in the Israeli case this kind of clear, explicit, and unashamed genocidal intent, which is very rare, right? Why do we see it? Because Israelis are imagining collectively, the vast majority, unfortunately, that they are fighting a colonial war here, right? A war against quote unquote savages, barbarians, human animals, Nazis. There's the genocidal intent was also accompanied by various forms and mechanisms of dehumanization, which should have made all the red lights flash right? Because we know what this language means from recent history, right? But this imagination about a colonial warfare is very important to what you're saying, because in the West and also in the international legal system, which is a Western-dominated system, it's still very much, you know, steeped in colonialism, right? And this is also the origins of international law, because international law, right, originated to regulate wars between quote unquote civilized nations, not colonial warfare, where there everything was permitted. That's why we're seeing this kind of genocidal intent, and that's why people are trying, as you say, to kind of deny, right, or, you know, blur, or say, you know, we didn't know that this was going to happen. Or the basic issue is that they really don't see Palestinians as people, right, as equal people deserving protection, you know, under the Genocide Convention in this way, right? This is what we're seeing, and this is also very much related to impunity in the international legal system, impunity to Israel, right? And this is why it's so important to now push this. The impunity to Israel is starting to crack, but it's very important to push this forward, because the whole system, which is again based on a colonial mindset that really doesn't see Palestinians as equal, right, as deserving protection in the system, needs to change, because it's actually, once we start to open it up, we see it's not only Palestinians. We live in a world with more than 100 million forcibly displaced people and refugees, right? Discarded by the nation state system, discarded by the international legal system, right? So this has far wider implication, and that's why many people in the global South, right, are rallying around the case of Gaza now, because they see clearly that this is an opportunity to change a system that doesn't see them as well, right, as equal and deserving protection.
Israeli impunity, the impunity that the Israeli state has enjoyed. And that's what we talked about a lot in the last interview we did. And we should note, by the way, that interview caused a big splash. It actually caused a big scandal involving Gary Lineker. For those who don't know, is the biggest sports personality in Britain. He shared an excerpt of the video and then got hounded and attacked and all the rest of it. But actually it helped, because it just meant more people watched the interview, particularly the clip, which went viral on Twitter. But about Israeli impunity, that's what we spoke about partly. And since we spoke, and obviously very recently now, we've had the International Criminal Court chief prosecutor requesting arrest warrants, which, if he said that a year ago, that the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, and his defense minister were ever going to get a request for an arrest warrant, people think you're basically on acid. And also the International Criminal Court of Justice's ruling, obviously, on ceasing military offensive in Rafah. What has it just collapsed now? Is that just the end of Israeli impunity?
No, I don't think we're yet at that point. But Israeli impunity has cracked significantly. It's important just for a minute to explain where this impunity comes from, right? Because it's actually baked into the international system from the very beginning. So very, very briefly, just to say, and this is tied actually to the crime of genocide, because when the crime of genocide is created in 1948, right, the immediate context, the background, is the Holocaust. No one used the word, of course, at that time, but the Nazi assault on the Jews, which was framed as unique, as exceptional, for various reasons, right? But the implication was that immediately a hierarchy was created where Nazism and the Nazi assault on Jews was placed in a hierarchy as more terrible than genocide, actually. Now, when you think about the field that I'm part of, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, this kind of hierarchy is embodied in the name of the field, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which is a very strange title, right? Because we all recognize that the Holocaust was a case of genocide. So what is this Holocaust and Genocide Studies? This is the hierarchy, right? That's from the very beginning. Now, this is very important because the Holocaust was framed as more terrible than genocide. Israel, as the state of Holocaust survivors, where indeed many Holocaust survivors tried to build their lives, was immediately then, from 48, placed on another hierarchy, right, as more moral than any other country in the world. That's the origins, by the way, of the common idea in Israel and the West that the Israeli army is the most moral in the world, right? This kind of absurd idea. Now, this is very important because this means these hierarchies, Holocaust and genocide, and Israel and other states and the Israeli army, is that the idea that Israel could commit any crime under international law, not to mention genocide, became basically unimaginable, unspeakable from the very beginning. That's why also there was immediately a necessity to deny the Nakba. So Nakba denial also became actually a structural systemic element in the international legal system. And this is all tied to the emergence of the crime of genocide, right? So impunity from Israel from the very beginning. Now, what we're seeing today was never supposed to happen. It's an accident of the system, right? It's happening because Israelis imagine that they're fighting a colonial warfare, right? And because the intent is so clear, we have actually clear indication of the crime of genocide. Now we have the charge of genocide against Israel in the ICJ. And the ICJ, in its 3 provisional orders, has repeated the fact that it is plausible that the rights of the Palestinians to be protected from genocide, right? That it's plausible that this right is violated, meaning that it's plausible that the crime of genocide is taking place, right? We have many scholars and experts in Holocaust and genocide studies who have talked about the fact that either Israel's attack on Gaza is genocide or that it's, there's a grave risk of genocide. And because of this, because we're now witnessing an Israeli assault on Gaza that is genocidal or plausibly genocidal, that's the reason that we have this crack in the impunity of Israel, because it originates, right, with the crime of genocide back in 1948. Now, it's important to say that, this is, again, there is, of course, incredible pushback, right, to maintain the system as it is, right? Anyone who just listened to U.S. President Joe Biden's speech just now before our interview, right? No mention of any Israeli crime whatsoever. Of course, not a genocide. The U.S. right rejects the process in the ICJ. The U.S., which is not a party to the Rome Statute, rejects the request for arrest warrants by Chief Prosecutor Khan against Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. And there are many people, of course, in the West who will do a lot to make sure that this crack in the Israeli impunity will not widen. But it's very important that it will widen, right? Because again, if we understand how the international legal system emerged with Israeli impunity and with Nakba denial, right, then this is, as I said, an opportunity to change the system with important implications for Palestinians and for Israel-Palestine in the future, but also much more than that. So yes, we are in the process, but we're not there. Impunity for Israel has not completely collapsed at all.
Before I just ask you just more about that in terms of the implications, I'm very interested, obviously, you're talking about in terms of, as an associate professor of Holocaust and genocide studies. But what strikes me is there was an ignorance, a popular ignorance about the history of genocide. And the Holocaust, I mean, look, you're the scholar here, is an outlier in that it's an industrialized attempt to exterminate an entire people in a very short space of time, a defense of the civilian population, which is why the Nazis then had to create these elaborate conspiracies of, well, they're not defenseless because there's the international Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy, and then they allied Bolshevism with Jewish people, and that's why actually, that's why they then invent to kind of, there was a war of self-defense. But the reason I bring this up is because the Holocaust is people's reference point for genocide in popular understanding, but actually many genocides throughout history are in the context of an armed conflict. So if you take Rwanda, where you have the Hutu extremists who slaughter the Tutsis, but there was the Rwandan Patriotic Front who, ostensibly represented the Tutsi minority, who did commit atrocities, which was then used by Hutu extremists to claim that they were going to commit genocide against them, that if we don't kill them, they'll kill us first. And the reason I bring this up, I'm just interested to your thoughts on, it strikes me that those who refute the idea that there was genocide in Gaza do so because the understanding of genocide is, generally speaking, the Holocaust, when actually in many other contexts, it is actually a war in which there are atrocities committed by multiple sides. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, look, in a way, this discussion is not relevant at all, right? In the sense that genocide is defined in international law in the UN Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. That's what genocide is. It doesn't have to look like the Holocaust, however you understand the Holocaust. Now, it's also important to say that, of course, the Holocaust was an unfolding process, right? We don't get immediately to mass murder in gas chambers, right? Which the Nazis really, the final solution of the Jewish question, right? This idea to murder all Jews within German reach, right? The Nazis make that decision in the spring of 1942. That's pretty, and in relation to the dynamics of the war, by the way, right? This is a very long and complex history, and we don't have time to get into it. But what's important to say is that it evolves from the idea of removing Jews from constantly expanding German territory. That is from what we would call today ethnic cleansing, right? And when ethnic cleansing efforts fail in the context of the war, right, that's what creates the intensification and escalation to the final solution to the German decision finally in the spring of 1942 to murder all Jews within German reach. Now, again, so it's important to mention this because ethnic cleansing, forced population transfer is a different crime than genocide, but it could become part of a genocide process, or it could actually be an integral part of the genocidal assault, as we actually see in the case of Gaza, right? But again, all this is actually beside the point in the sense that what is genocide, right? Mm-hmm. It's what's defined as genocide in the convention. Right?
That makes perfect sense. Because the reason that's is just in people's, that's often been the counter argument made by those who rebut claims.
Again, what I would say to that is actually, again, what people imagine that the Holocaust was is usually very far from what we know that the Holocaust was in research, right? And how it evolved, right? And it's a very complex history that actually does tell us a lot of things also about what's going on in Gaza today. Again, if we just think about intent, right? So we know what language that dehumanizes people means, right? We know it also a lot because of the Nazis, right? Not only because of the Nazis, but also because of the Nazis. So there are actually ways to relate what's going on in Gaza to Nazism and the Holocaust today. But again, I would say that what's important is how genocide is defined in international law, right? In order to have this discussion. And this is, so this is very important. It's not how someone imagines the Holocaust, right? And many people, when they think about the Holocaust today, what they're actually doing is imagining the Holocaust, right?
In terms of the here and now, in terms of what happens next, because what we spoke about before was what you described as a Milosevic moment. And obviously, Slobodan Milosevic, for those who, I'm sure most people know who we're talking about, he was the former leader, the president of Serbia during the Yugoslav wars. And he ended up being, well, there was an attempt to put him on trial for the war crimes and including obviously Srebrenica, which officially was defined as genocide, but for his involvement in the war crimes committed during the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s, he died. So that never, he committed suicide. Sorry, yes, just so I remember. Yeah, so that never happened. But in my head, because I remember speaking about this, and I thought, well, Netanyahu, Milosevic, very different relationship, Serbia compared to Israel, so this will never happen. I'm just interested, what do you think will happen next? Could there be a Milosevic moment? Do you still think that?
Well, I mean, I said just before we started the interview, I mentioned Milosevic's moment for Netanyahu with the request for arrest warrants now, and hopefully we will see these arrest warrants. And actually, as Chief Prosecutor Khan said, the investigation is ongoing, and we might see more arrest warrants. I mean, the key issue is that Netanyahu is not Milosevic, and this will have far greater implications again for the international system as such. And this is what's important to understand because, Chief Prosecutor Khan is actually an integral part of the system that has maintained Israeli impunity, right, until the 7th of October. So it tells us a lot when someone like this, right, moves to request arrest warrants against Israel Prime Minister and Israel Defense Minister. Of course, there are many, many others who should be targeted by the ICC investigation. But it tells us a lot already when this is happening. And why is it happening? Because Chief Prosecutor Khan understands that the system itself now is under attack, right? Because we have this accident, Israeli genocidal assault, right? And now the issue is that it's clear that the US government and its allies would actually like to do away with the international legal system, right? I mean, they're not part of the Rome Statute. The whole system is really a hindrance to American interests and American imperial violence around the world. I mean, think about the international arms trade, right, which ensures that there's continuous wars and conflict and mass violence and genocide around the world. So doing away with the system, right, would be, now that it's exposed in this kind of way, this is an opportunity to do away with it. And this is a grave danger for the system. This is the reason that we see someone like Khan, who is committed, I think, to the system, right, move to request these arrest warrants, because he doesn't want the system to collapse, right? And this is why, this is what I'm talking about now, that we have an opportunity to create a significant change in the international legal system, right? I mean, the international legal system, like anything, it changes, right? It's not something that stands still. And that's why I think that these arrests, so a Milosevic moment would be very different than Milosevic, right? It would have far greater implications. And because Netanyahu is under a lot of pressure within Israel, as Milosevic actually was also in the Serbian case, we have this opportunity, perhaps somehow, who knows? I mean, it's all very unprecedented and fluid, so it's difficult to really say what might happen, but we have this potential. It is important to say in this context that when you look at the press conference of Chief Prosecutor Khan when he announced the request for arrest warrants, he devoted towards the end about a minute and a half or so to the issue of impunity. Specifically, he emphasized this, right? And this is the reason that he emphasized it, right? Because he actually also recognizes that impunity, which was, again, a structural element of the international legal system, that he was part of it, right, now has to change, because otherwise the whole system is under attack. It's very important to say that, you know, also he is doing everything he can to kind of maintain what he can. So, for example, the request so far refers only to the period after 7th of October. In this way, it partakes in this complete blurring and distortion of the context of the ongoing Nakba, the ongoing Israeli settler colonial violence that brought us to the 7th of October, that brought us to Israel's attack on Gaza. And there's many other shortcomings that we can talk about, and many people have talked about. But still, it's a very, very important move in this process of widening the crack, right, of Israeli impunity today, together, of course, with the process in the ICJ and the 3 provisional orders so far that we've seen.
I mean, given, for example, President Biden's response to the ICC chief prosecutor's request for arrest warrants, and also several US politicians, including their menacing of the ICC, is there a danger of, I mean, I know all the Western states did actually come out to defend, for example, the ICC and the ICJ, but is there a danger of, you know, kind of contagion where whatever we think about the international order and the way it's rigged in favor of the global north and its allies, that will just cause further destabilization of already imploding system, and kind of, you know, whatever law exists and however problematic it might be, if Joe Biden is throwing the ICC under a bus, then where does that lead us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, yes, there is the situation is, as I said, I think it's incredibly unprecedented. And I think it is very important to maintain the international legal system, but make sure that it changes very significantly, as it should, right? Because international law, which is far, far from perfect, as I said, it emerges actually from the colonial world, from the idea of colonial violence, right? But if it changes in this, you know, unprecedented moment, it's one of the tools that we have, and we look at the world around us today. There's, you know, the rise of right-wing populism, extreme right, fascism across the board, really. We definitely need an international legal system, but we need a different international legal system. And we're in a moment where this could happen. It requires, much more effort, much more pressure. And yes, there is the danger. I mean, that's, for me, it's very clear that for the U.S. government and its allies, no international legal system is better. Yes, so this is an incredibly dangerous moment.
In terms of what happens next, because obviously we have the genocidal onslaught in Gaza, we also have the question of the West Bank. There are more Palestinians living in the West Bank than there are in Gaza, and obviously it shouldn't be not on the people's radar, but it should be said there's been horrific violence waged against Palestinians in the West Bank over the last few months. Hundreds have been killed by Israeli settlers, by Israeli security services, by Israeli security forces, as well as grotesque human rights abuses, people driven from their homes. I'm just wondering what you think about, and it should be noted that the ICC was investigating crimes against humanity and war crimes generally in the occupied territories, including in the West Bank. And it's revealed this week that the former head of Mossad was menacing the former chief prosecutor, the predecessor of Karim Khan, including essentially threatening her and her family over this, which I think, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. But what do you think about what happens next? Not just Gaza, but we're talking about the what should be known as the Palestinian state.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the what we now know about Israeli efforts, including the head of the Mossad himself, right, stalking and threatening the former chief prosecutor of the ICC. This really tells us all we need to know about Israeli impunity, about the sense of impunity, right? This kind of mafia behavior, right? That we can do anything we want, however we want, anywhere we want, right? And this is also breaking down now, right? This is an incredible, I think an incredible embarrassment, though who knows how most Israelis feel this way about these kinds of things, if they feel that is indeed an embarrassment. But yes, I mean, we are also part of the ways in which this moment is incredibly dangerous, as I said, is that, genocide prevention in Gaza has failed. Part of the rationale of studying genocide, of dealing with genocide, is to prevent genocide. And genocide prevention in Gaza has failed. We have to be clear about this. It's incredibly important to stop the unfolding genocide now. But now there's the ongoing and intensifying Israeli assault on the West Bank and East Jerusalem. But I would actually like to point out also that there is nearly 2 million Israeli Palestinians, the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And they're actually in an I would argue, maybe even the most vulnerable situation, right? Especially when we think about the distribution of thousands of weapons by Israel Internal Security Minister, the settler Ben-Gvir, right? After 7th of October, he's distributed thousands of weapons in Israel, created these kind of civilian self-defense units, right? There's an intense genocidal discourse in Israel today in politics and media and society. People talk openly, right, about the murder of Palestinian children in Gaza and so on and so forth. This all means that any kind of further deterioration of the situation, a regional conflict, a war with Hezbollah in the north, an escalation of violence in the West Bank, right, places Israeli Palestinian and the most vulnerable population. They're actually considered by many Israelis as the enemy within, right? Which places them similar to, say, Armenians in the Ottoman Empire during World War I, Tutsis in Rwanda during the Rwanda genocide, and in other cases. So this is, when we think about why it's important to continue talking about genocide, accountability, and thinking about Gaza definitely, right, and stopping the Israeli unfolding attack on Gaza, but also looking at prevention. And this also is one of the reasons that breaking down impunity, the ICJ process, the ICC process, and then also intensifying, all the BDS efforts is very, very important, right? Anything that, furthers the aim of making sure that Israel can't continue this assault will also then figure in actually preventing a possible, attack that could be horrendous on Israeli Palestinians, right? So that's another reason that insisting on the framework of genocide now is incredibly important.
Just finally on that, because I think you mentioned boycott, divestment, sanctions. For those who don't know, the movement very much modelled on the movement against South African apartheid. Now, I can never get my head around just how irresponsible at a time when clearly actual anti-Semitism is clearly rising, and we know anti-Semitism is a grave, grave evil, which within living memory, of course, was responsible for the show when 6 million Jews being murdered in a very short space of time. The way anti-Semitism has been, Benjamin Netanyahu described Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor, as one of the great anti-Semites of our time, saying he will join the German judges of the 1930s who laid the way for the Holocaust. It's not. I say that's laughable, but it's not funny. It's not funny for lots of reasons, but it's not funny for a start because people just will start hearing anti-Semitism and stop believing in it, which is incredibly dangerous. I'm just interested in your thoughts about, because you're a scholar, part of the Holocaust. You're an Israeli-American associate professor. You know how grave anti-Semitism is, and how we have a discussion about that weaponization in that context.
Yeah, there's, of course, this is a very, this has a history of more than 2 decades now. It's an Israeli project, right, of weaponizing anti-Semitism, basically focusing the discussion of anti-Semitism only on Israel. So any critique of the state of Israel becomes anti-Semitism. All this, of course, is very much intensified as well after 7th of October. And of course, BDS efforts, right, have been seen by Israel and its supporters, and also a lot in the US, right? And this is also through law, right, which is very dangerous as anti-Semitism. And nothing, of course, could be farther from the truth. It's exactly the opposite, right? The struggle against violent states, right, in defense of a persecuted group, right, in defense of a group that now faces extreme violence, even if not genocide. Okay, let's put for a minute the question of genocide aside. People who face extreme violence by a violent state, right, protecting them, struggling against a violent state, is actually very much in line with the historical struggle of anti-Semitism, against anti-Semitism, right, which was a struggle to protect Jews, a group, from violent and discriminatory and exclusionary states, right? So it's exactly the opposite, that weaponization of the discourse of anti-Semitism now basically aims to protect a state, right, against any critique of its attack against a group, which is a world turned upside down. It's really, as a Jew, as a scholar of the Jewish world, as a scholar of the Holocaust, and as a scholar of anti-Semitism, this is really horrific, right? And the way that it's now becoming, law in some cases, including here in the U.S. in various ways, is incredibly dangerous. It's incredibly dangerous, of course, for Palestinians. It's incredibly dangerous for Arabs, for Palestinians, for Muslims here in the U.S. But it's also incredibly dangerous for Jews, right? Because it actually diverts attention, right, from very real anti-Semitism that is actually rising recently across the West, right? It diverts attention from that, right? It tells us, no, we're not looking at that. We're going to look now only at protecting a violent state now, Israel, right? And therefore, it also places Jews in danger. And of course, right, the people who are usually engaged in this weaponization in many cases are themselves anti-Semites and white supremacists, right? Which again places all these people, including Jews, right, in further danger. So this is really, this is a horrific situation. There's also a whole struggle, against this weaponization, which is very difficult. But this is this is part of the way that the way that we've been thinking about the Holocaust, the way that we've been thinking about anti-Semitism in the last 20 years, from the perspective of states rather than from the perspective of people attacked by states, which should be the legacy of the Holocaust, which should be at the center, right, of Holocaust and genocide studies, has now led us here. I'll just say one more thing, that it is exactly, if we look now at the voices of Palestinians, at the testimonies of Palestinians from Gaza, from the West Bank, from East Jerusalem, from Israeli Palestinians, from Palestinians around the world, their voices, their testimonies, their perspectives, their accounts are incredibly, especially because of everything I said, are incredibly important to center them, but they also now point to us for a different future, a different kind of Holocaust memory, right? So if once it was the Jewish, and it's still the Jewish victims and survivors of the Holocaust that who are very central in Holocaust and genocide studies and education and memory, now we also have a potential, right, to think about in a different way than centering the perspective of the state, right, and thinking about anti-Semitism and state violence and all these things, but recentering the perspective of the people who face state violence. We can do this through the voices and perspective and testimonies of Palestinians today. So this is also an incredibly important point, and points to potential for change, right? In the that again, we're not there at all, right? But we're in the process. There is potential, but there's a long way ahead of us.
Brilliant stuff as ever. Always full of, obviously informed by your astonishing scholarly work, but also your precision, your moral clarity. Let's see if a British sports personality wishes to cause another mini scandal with our famous, the intellectually curious British media, which always acts in good faith at all times. But I think people can see why Gary Lineker, for a start, was so informed and educated by what you said. And I know when I read through the comments on Twitter, on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, elsewhere, when I posted what you had to say, it had a huge impact, I have to say, on a lot of people. You've educated a huge number of people throughout this horror show. So your work's been so invaluable. So it's always an honor to be able to speak to you. So do like, subscribe, leave your comments. Please share the video. Make sure everyone hears far and wide what Raz has to say. But Raz Segal, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for speaking to me.
Thank you, and for the opportunity. Thank you.